Welcome to Life Stories. Today, we bring you a tale about a successful yet work-obsessed billionaire CEO, Jake Westbrook, whose life takes an unexpected turn when he receives a call from the hospital on Christmas Eve. A woman from his past, Olivia, is in labor with his child, and Jake is forced to confront the choices he's made. As he grapples with the responsibility of fatherhood, Jake discovers profound lessons about love, sacrifice, and the true meaning of success. Sit back and relax as we dive into this emotional journey. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to start today's story. Jake Westbrook sat at his desk, his sharp eyes scanning the financial reports that seemed to stretch endlessly across his screen. The cold December night outside painted the skyline of New York City with a soft, frozen glow, as if the entire city had been blanketed under a sheet of glass. The lights of Manhattan twinkled, distant and unimportant, much like the holidays he had long abandoned. For Jake, Christmas was just another day, a distraction, an unnecessary pause in the relentless pursuit of his empire. To him, time was money, and money was all that mattered. The office was pristine, its sleek design a testament to his years of calculated decisions, ruthless ambition, and his ability to make the world bend to his will. A crystal tumbler of untouched whiskey sat on the corner of his glass desk, the liquid shimmering like the false promise of relaxation. He didn't need it, not now, not with the billion-dollar merger that was teetering on the edge of completion. This deal, this one moment, was the culmination of everything Jake had worked for. It would secure his place at the top for years to come. His assistant, David, lingered near the door, looking as out of place as someone who hadn't fully grasped the meaning of ambition. Jake barely noticed him, his fingers moving swiftly over the keyboard as he typed in a final few numbers that would push his company forward. A knock on the door was met with a brief pause. But not a glance. "Sir, the team's heading out. I can finish the projections before morning," David said, his voice a bit hesitant. Jake barely lifted his gaze from the screen. "Good. I want everything ironclad before the market opens." David hesitated, clearly trying to find the right words. "I was going to say I can leave them on your desk, since..." "Well, it's Christmas Eve." Jake finally looked up, his eyebrow arched. "Most people go home to their families," David had said. Jake could see it written in his eyes. But that wasn't a sentiment Jake had ever understood. Christmas was just another excuse for weakness. It was a distraction that blurred focus and made people lazy. It was why he wasn't like most people. He smirked, dismissing the notion without a second thought. "I don't waste time on things that don't yield returns," Jake replied coldly. David exhaled a sigh, muttering a quiet, "Merry Christmas, sir," before exiting the room. Jake didn't notice. Once alone again, he turned back to his screen, eyes scanning the data and reports. But a part of him was already thinking ahead, planning the next step, the next move in his vast chess game of business. There was always another deal to be made. There was always something else to conquer. There was no time for anything else. His phone buzzed, breaking the silence. Without a second thought, Jake picked it up, not even glancing at the caller ID. His voice was clipped, sharp. "Westbrook." There was a pause on the other end, followed by a voice Jake didn't recognize. It was a woman, and the urgency in her tone cut through the cold air of the room. "Mr. Westbrook, this is St. Joseph's Medical Center. We need you to come in immediately." Jake's frown deepened. He didn't have time for this. "Not interested," he muttered, ready to hang up. He had dealt with enough telemarketers and prank calls over the years. But the woman's voice stopped him, laced with panic. "Sir, your wife, she's in labor. She needs you here now." Jake actually laughed, shaking his head. "Nice try, but you've got the wrong guy." There was a silence on the other end, just enough hesitation for Jake to feel a cold twist in his stomach. His laughter faded, and his grip on the phone tightened. "I don't have a wife," he said, his voice firm. The pause on the other end of the line lingered a bit too long. "Mr. Westbrook," the nurse continued, this time her voice softer, more careful, "the patient's name is Olivia Miller. She listed you as the father. Jake froze. The words hit him like a physical blow. And for a moment, he couldn't think, couldn't move. The name Olivia echoed in his mind. A distant memory from a life he thought was far behind him. He hadn't seen her in over a year. He had left her, made the choice to walk away, thinking she deserved better than a man who prioritized deals over everything else. He had told himself that she would be fine, that it was the right decision, that business was his life now. But now she was in labor. His mind raced, but his body didn't move. Olivia, his child, the words were just too much. The nurse's voice broke through his fog of thoughts. She's not doing well. Mr. Westbrook, you need to come now. The chair scraped against the polished floor as he stood abruptly, the weight of the world crashing down on him. Every step he took felt heavier than the last. He grabbed his coat, his hands numb as they fumbled to put it on. His heart hammered in his chest. There was a child, his child, fighting for life. And he had no idea what to expect. His mind was a whirlwind of questions he didn't have answers to. And yet his body was moving, pushing him forward into something he hadn't planned for, something he hadn't wanted but couldn't ignore. The elevator doors slid open with a soft ping. And as Jake stepped inside, the weight of what he had just learned settled heavily on his shoulders. His mind raced through the possibilities, Olivia, a baby, and the life he had walked away from. His thoughts crashed against one another, and for the first time, Jake felt completely out of control. The city seemed to blur past as he rushed to the hospital. The bright lights of New York reflected off the wet pavement, the streets alive with the noise of the season. But none of it registered to Jake. All he could think about was the life he had abandoned, the woman he had walked away from, and the child he had never known about until now. The car screeched to a halt outside the hospital, the sudden motion jolting Jake out of his thoughts. He slammed the door shut behind him, not bothering to acknowledge the stunned looks from the staff as he moved through the lobby. Every part of him was focused on one thing: getting to Olivia. Getting to his child. But when the nurse finally led him to the room, everything seemed to stop. The weight of what he was about to face was too much to bear. The sterile, harsh lights of the hospital hall seemed to stretch endlessly before him, each step heavier than the last. Jake's heart was thudding against his ribs, the sound in his ears drowning out everything around him. The nurse moved quickly, her footsteps quick, efficient, as if she already knew the urgency of the moment. The walls were bare, the air thick with antiseptic, the scent of it overwhelming in its cleanliness. Jake could hear the faint beeping of machines in the distance, the occasional hushed voices of nurses and doctors passing by. Yet all of that seemed muffled, distant, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The nurse stopped outside a room, and without a word, she gestured for Jake to follow her inside. His mind was too clouded to fully process the emotion in her eyes, the sympathy and pity she seemed to be holding back. Jake's eyes locked onto the door in front of him, his hands shaking slightly as he reached for the handle. He couldn't tell himself to stop. He couldn't even tell himself to breathe. His feet moved forward of their own accord, like a man walking toward the unknown. The door opened, and as it did, Jake's mind seemed to implode. There, in the middle of the room, was Olivia. She was lying in a bed, her face pale, her body still, and yet her absence, her silence, screamed louder than anything else. The room felt cold in a way that didn't seem possible. His throat went dry, and his heart sank to the pit of his stomach. This wasn't right. This couldn't be happening. She was supposed to be here, alive, breathing, with their child in her arms. She had to be. A doctor, an older man with tired eyes, stepped forward, his face expressionless, too familiar with the grim task at hand. "I'm sorry, Mr. Westbrook," the doctor said quietly, as if he was aware that Jake could barely stand, that the weight of this moment was threatening to break him. "She fought hard to bring your son into the world. But she didn't make it." The world seemed to spin around him, the words barely registering in his mind. Olivia, gone. The woman he had once loved, who had carried his child, his son, was dead. Jake's legs felt like jelly beneath him. The shock of it hit him like a punch to the gut. And he staggered back a step. This couldn't be real. It was all a bad dream, a nightmare. He blinked, trying to reset his perception, to change the cruel reality he was being forced to live in. But it didn't work. The doctor's eyes softened, his voice gentle. "I'm very sorry, but your son..." The doctor paused, perhaps knowing what he was about to say might tear through Jake's fragile composure even further. "He's here. He's alive." Jake's breath caught in his throat. His son, the child he hadn't known about until hours ago. He forced himself to step forward, each movement slow, deliberate, as if time itself had stopped. The weight of everything, the past, the regrets, the mistakes, seemed to crash over him. But he had no choice but to move. He couldn't stop now. The doctor led him across the room, where a small bassinet stood, barely noticeable at first glance. But Jake's eyes immediately locked on the tiny bundle lying inside. There, swaddled in a soft hospital blanket, was his son, small, fragile, and impossibly perfect. Jake felt an unfamiliar tug in his chest. Something warm, something deep. He reached out cautiously, as if afraid his touch would break this delicate thing. This life that now depended entirely on him. The nurse who had brought him here stepped forward, a gentle smile crossing her face. "Would you like to hold him, Mr. Westbrook?" she asked softly. Jake didn't answer immediately. He simply stood there, staring down at the tiny face, his son's face. The same eyes, the same soft, helpless expression. A rush of emotion filled his chest, suffocating him. He had spent so long focused on his empire, his career, that he had neglected what truly mattered, what should have mattered all along. The nurse, sensing his hesitation, gently placed the baby in his arms, adjusting his tiny body with care. Jake's hands, once used to signing multi-million-dollar contracts and dictating terms to the world, felt clumsy now. He stiffened instinctively, unsure of what to do next. The baby made a tiny noise, barely audible, and Jake held his breath, terrified that his shaky hands might somehow harm him. But then, something miraculous happened. The baby shifted slightly, as if seeking warmth, and instinctively, his tiny hand reached out, grasping Jake's finger. It was the smallest of movements, but it was enough to undo something inside him. Something he hadn't realized had been locked away for so long. Jake inhaled sharply, a tear slipping down his cheek, though he didn't even notice it at first. He held the baby closer, the tiny heartbeat beneath his hands the only sound in the room. His mind raced, overwhelmed by the weight of it all, the child he didn't know he had. The woman he had abandoned. The life he had chosen over love. Now, it was too late for regrets. But at that moment, holding his son in his arms, Jake realized he had a chance to fix something. He wasn't going to let this child grow up without a father. Not again, not like he had. Jake's heart thundered in his chest. And he made a promise in that moment, one that was more important than any business deal, any merger, or any contract. He would be there for this child, no matter what. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Jake Westbrook, the man who had built an empire on control, found himself humbled by something beyond his understanding. Something simple, yet profoundly powerful. The weight of love. The days that followed felt like a blur to Jake. After the hospital, everything seemed surreal. His life, once meticulously controlled, had been turned upside down. The very idea of being a father was something Jake had never fully considered. It wasn't that he had lacked love, he had simply placed it on the back burner of his life, telling himself that there was no room for emotion in a world driven by cold, hard logic. But now, as he sat in his penthouse, holding his son in his arms, he realized that nothing in his empire could have prepared him for this. His home, which had once been pristine and orderly, was now filled with an unfamiliar chaos. He had hardly slept, the baby crying through the night, his tiny form nestled in Jake's arms or beside him in a bassinet. The first night he'd brought his son home had been an exercise in complete exhaustion. But Jake didn't know how to stop. He couldn't bear the thought of not being there for the baby. Not after everything that had happened. Every waking moment felt like a fight for control he no longer had. The baby refused to be comforted by anyone but Jake. He had hired an entire team of nannies and baby nurses, each of them trained professionals. But none of them could calm the infant like Jake could. He could hear the desperation in the nurses' voices, trying to coax the baby into settling. But the second they laid him down, the cries would start. His son would scream until Jake picked him up again. And only then would the noise soften into quiet hiccups and whimpers. The feeling of being needed in that way, it was new. And Jake wasn't sure how to handle it. He had spent years being the one others depended on. But now he was the one who was needed. And it scared him more than anything else ever had. One morning, Jake found himself pacing the living room. The baby nestled against his chest, his tiny head resting on Jake's shoulder. The baby's breath was warm and soft against his skin. But Jake couldn't focus on that. Instead, he was trying to focus on a conference call he was having with the board members of his company. He had never been good at multitasking. And now it was proving to be his undoing. The baby, unsettled and fussy, started crying in his arms. And Jake's attention flickered between the board meeting on his laptop and the baby. "Sir, are you all right?" His CFO's voice came through the speaker, snapping Jake back into focus. "I'm fine," Jake muttered, trying to hide the frustration in his voice. "Let's proceed with the numbers." But just then, as if to emphasize the chaos in his life, the baby made a loud gurgling noise. Jake froze, the sound familiar yet humiliating in the silence of the meeting. The warm liquid soaked through his suit jacket, and he felt the baby's soft weight against him grow heavier with every passing second. "Sir?" the CFO's voice came again, more concerned now. Yes, Jake muttered, trying to control his irritation. "I was talking to the baby, not you." His voice was dry, devoid of emotion, as he wiped off the spit up with a napkin, trying to keep up the facade of calmness. He ended the call abruptly. As soon as he hung up, he let out a long, frustrated sigh. This wasn't what he had signed up for. But as he stood there, holding the baby in his arms, he couldn't ignore the feeling creeping over him. This wasn't about work. This wasn't about the empire he had built. This was about something much bigger, much more important, than anything he had ever known. That night, Jake found himself sitting in the living room with a new sense of resolve. The exhaustion weighed on him. But it wasn't the same as before. He wasn't just tired because of work. He was tired because he was learning how to be a father. The next day, Jake hired a parenting coach, a no-nonsense woman named Linda who wasn't there to coddle him but to push him to grow. She walked him through the basics, feeding, soothing, and, most importantly, understanding his son's needs. Jake listened, absorbing the advice she gave with a mixture of skepticism and desperation. "You're the only one who can give him security," she told him firmly. "You're the only one who knows him right now. Don't let anyone else tell you how to do this." Jake took the advice to heart. The weeks that followed were some of the most challenging of his life. He learned how to swaddle his son, how to comfort him with gentle rocking, how to soothe his cries with a calming voice. Slowly but surely, the baby seemed to settle, just a little. And with every small victory, Jake's heart began to shift. His son was teaching him things he never thought he needed to learn. As the years passed, Jake's life began to transform in ways he hadn't anticipated. Fatherhood was not a role he had ever planned on, but it was the one that shaped him more profoundly than any business deal ever could. His penthouse, once a symbol of solitude and control, had become a place of laughter, mess, and warmth. There were toys scattered across the floor, pictures of his son's milestones on every wall, and the constant hum of life in the background. Jake had found his purpose in fatherhood, the kind of fulfillment that no stock market win or boardroom victory could offer. The relentless hours spent building an empire had been replaced by late-night feedings, school events, and the comforting rhythm of everyday life. He was there for his son, Finn, through every challenge, every triumph, and every quiet moment in between. He realized that the true measure of success wasn't in profits or acquisitions. It was in the love and time spent with those who mattered most. One Christmas Eve, as Jake looked around his home filled with holiday decorations, he realized how far he had come. No longer the man obsessed with numbers. He was now a father who cherished every moment with his son. Finn, now full of energy and curiosity, ran through the house, filling it with joy. As Jake sat down to watch him, he smiled. The lessons he had learned, the importance of love, family, and connection, had been the true gifts. Jake had everything he needed now. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel to follow more heartwarming life stories. Thank you for watching.